So one thing that the German consulting group always does when they run their workshops is they bring a mixture of internals and externals together. So people from other industry settings. That's a pretty good mechanism, I find, because people from a different industry often think quite differently. But if they're on their own, they lack the fine-grained understanding of a particular setting and context. Now, bringing them together, you often get this unusual way of thinking combined with what's really doable to get to some jams. I think that's one way to get into this. I have found if you probe things the right way, then you can also get good unusual ideas. And there's one particular exercise that I like a lot. It's called a nightmare competitor exercise, where the task for different groups is come up with a competitor that does not exist. You have no restrictions in terms of, economics, funding, etc. for this competitor, but think of a company that would be a true nightmare for your own company. And that allows people, to think outside the box automatically. That tends to work really well too. Plus people love that kind of thing.
My guest is someone who just doesn't study strategy, he challenges the way it's made. Welcome, Professor Christian Stadler. He teaches at the University of Warwick and has spent, I think, the last 20 years researching how organizations grow, adapt, and outlast disruption. His latest book, Open Strategy, calls for a radical rethinking of the strategy process, from exclusive to inclusive, from closed door to co-creation. Christian, welcome. And directly the first question, what is Open Strategy all about?
Well, first of all, thanks for pronouncing my name correctly. I don't often get that on a podcast, but our common Germanic sort of heritage, mine Austrian, you're German, makes it possible. But to your question. So you're asking, what is open strategy? Traditionally, strategy is made by a small group of people who are part of the senior management, maybe some celebrated consulting team supporting them. And if we go even more traditional, it's a group of older white men, like the two of us, I guess, and maybe even older. There's certain drawbacks in this type of model. It's harder to see unusual things, and it makes it more difficult to convince people further down the hierarchy that this is actually good stuff and you should do it. So therefore, the alternative I propose is involve more people in strategy making. And then, the details is all about how to do this, how to do this in an effective way, and therefore get more out of the strategy making.
What exactly made you realize that traditional strategy was no longer enough? So as you say, the old white man sitting behind closed doors and kind of like figuring it out themselves, the boys club.
I have to admit it was not me realizing it. The way this whole project came about is that the three co-authors I had for the book, they were involved in this a little longer. Particularly one of them, Stefan Friedrich von den Eichen, he runs a consulting company in Germany that has for years helped clients do exactly this. And the three of them were having a clandestine meeting in Munich where they were wondering, okay, we'd like to do a book. Who knows how to write books for a more international audience? They knew me. With two of them, I've been working on other topics for many years. And so they were wondering, so how do they convince me to join this? And when they first told me about this, I thought these guys are bananas. Yeah. I mean, I've been for long enough in strategy that I've seen it the way it's usually been done. Yeah. With the top leaders taking charge of this. But I was also curious. So I decided I will join some of those workshops the consulting company was running. I then, as this started to look pretty cool to me, I started to do some interviews with other organizations that were not working directly with them, but have done this. So I grew into the topic pretty much. Yeah. And not because I was seeing it, but others saw it and thought I could get involved in this. That's really how I stumbled on it.
How much do you think is there pressure from the outside that leaders, or so-called leaders, think it is their job to do the strategy? Because I remember my wife at the big German bank she used to work for, I think they had a leadership workshop, and it wasn't with her boss. But she came into a discussion with the coach, and the coach then said, no, 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 no. The strategy, where things are going, that's job of your boss. And that's the responsibility of your boss. That is not your job. So how much of that old boys club behavior do you think is pressure from the outside rather than that the leadership really desperately wants to keep people out?
It's an interesting and tricky question. It probably depends a lot on the setting, and setting being both country and industry, where things are done differently. You think a startup scene in San Francisco, it's quite natural that you talk widely and with many people. If you are well, it's hard, what to point at. Let's say, you are in a more hierarchical society like Japan, and in a very traditional industry like steel over there. I'm speculating. I've not worked in Japan or steel. It's probably in this type of setting where it's a lot harder to get people involved because everyone expects the boss to be the boss. Is it possible to do things differently? I think so. I've, for example, done these things in the Middle East, which traditionally is also quite hierarchical, and it worked phenomenally well. It might take an intermediate step. So in that setting, we have first run something separate for the middle management and the executive team. And then in a second stage, we brought everyone together after both top and middle management saw, well, actually, this works pretty well. People who are in mid-level have good ideas. They're constructive. It's not, as if they have lower abilities to do so. And they also understand that this is a consultation process. It's not like, we take a vote in the end, what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the Middle East. I worked in Turkey for about 3 years, I think 2.5 or 3 years, in a media agency. And I made a similar experience. So on the one hand, it's quite traditional and hierarchical. And there was a lot of expectation from me as the strategy lead. But everybody was obviously pretty smart and very open when I opened it up. And I think probably there's always a difference, almost like in a racy scheme. So between who is responsible and who is accountable. I think and I saw the other side. Sometimes I had in my career, I had the feeling that leaders or the people on top, on the very top, were actually dodging a little bit the accountability and were trying to outsource the accountability to their junior management. And I think that's not okay. And
No,
I don't think that's open strategy. So they say, like, you do it, you take the responsibility for it. No, 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 no. You're still kind of like, you still need to be accountable, but you can let other people do it, and also in a supervised fashion, let other people decide.
No, absolutely. That's a question of character to some extent as well. I've done an interview last Friday for a new project I have where I look at people who achieved extraordinary things in their life. And the person I interviewed was former senior manager. He was running John Lewis, one of the big department stores in the UK. And afterwards, he went into politics, was mayor of Birmingham, and he lost the last election. A reason why I was drawn towards him is that election night, he's from Birmingham, and Birmingham is traditionally more of a Labour city. The country was swinging far away from the Conservatives. He was a conservative politician. Now, so he lost, I think, really because the mood was anti-Tory rather than anything else. But that election night, he didn't even attempt to put the blame on anybody else. Yeah, he just said straight up when he was asked, this was an election. For me, as a mayor, I ran, I lost. That's at the end of the story. And he was seeing himself as accountable. He took responsibility. I really quite liked it. And of course, he's not happy about losing, but he doesn't blame anybody else.
So if you open up the strategy process, first two questions out, I'd like to go a little bit into the details of why traditional processes where leaders sort of do it behind closed doors, why do they fail? And what's the evidence of that this is really not a good thing? And the second one is, if you really open it up, who gets a seat at the table? Is that then the leadership level just below the top leadership level? Is that everybody? Is there a selection process? How do that work? Sorry, two questions. So first question is, why do these traditional processes fail?
I start with some numbers, yeah. So there's quite a lot of research. Do strategies work or do they not work? And these surveys typically ask managers, is the expectation that you have also fulfilled once you run the strategy in real life. And numbers vary, but it's somewhere between 60 and 90% of all initiatives fail. That's a pretty bad number considering that there's so much time and money spent on strategy. Just on the top 3 strategy consulting firms, every year companies spend around 30 billion. There's been a piece of research where it was Michael Porter, yeah, had one of his assistants take the details of how CEOs spend their time, and they spend more than 20% of their time on strategy. So, lots of time, lots of money being spent on this. Nonetheless, many of these things fail. Now, why? I kind of give you a couple reasons and then dive into this a bit with maybe some stories. Yeah, it makes it fun. Number one, difficult to see around the corner, to realize when there is disruption and sort of things that are not aligned with the current business model. That's the first problem. Second problem is stuff that sounds really great in the boardroom. Once it hits the people somewhere in the operational front line, they don't like it. They don't think it works. And somehow, things go wrong during execution. And let me give you a lovely story for this second part first, which, you being from Germany might resonate very well. It's a story from Daimler. So Daimler, you might remember this, yeah? They had this idea it was in the East that they want to transform into this integrated technology conglomerate, where instead of producing the big and expensive cars, they're going to do all sorts of other things. Yeah, they're going to move into defense. They're going to go into consulting, wide range. Yeah, this was driven by Edzard Reuter, who was in politics.
I remember the name. Yes.
Yeah. So this sounded like a good answer to this new problem that they had. That there were other strong competitors emerging in the high-end car business. So Lexus was sort of just starting to take off. BMW got stronger in these years as well. So on paper, this sounded great. But now put yourself into the shoes of somebody who was working in Untertürkheim, this is a district in Stuttgart, for Mercedes. You used to work for the coolest company in town. So every evening, you take your big fat Mercedes, you drive it home, you park it in front of your house, and your neighbors come over. They're a bit jealous. They want to find out how you can get them a job with Mercedes as well. So, life is pretty good for you working for this company. Now, after these new activities, Daimler is a different company, particularly in the public perception, because some of those new initiatives were going into the defense industry. And I'm sure you're more aware of this than me, but in the 1980s, defense was not a particularly cool place to be in. Yeah, there were enough people with the sort of memory from the Second World War that this is something you stirred away from. So overnight, you're working for a company where the media is writing about, awful company does all sorts of horrible stuff. Now, you kind of stay in the office a bit longer, so it's getting a bit dark. Yeah, you drive your car behind the house and you sneak in because otherwise the neighbors come over and confront you how you can possibly work for these guys. Now, if you are somebody who worked for the car part of this company, your enthusiasm to work with the guys in defense is probably slightly limited. But the whole idea about this diversification is that people work across the different industries, they get fresh ideas and do something entirely different. In other words, in reality, what you find for working there is not really that great as it looked like to be from the top end of the organization. And a bit of an extreme example, yes, but that you do stuff that just doesn't quite work when people have to do it. That's a fairly common problem. Now, the obvious way to avoid this is getting people's voices already in the strategy making process, where they can sort of, bring up things that are important to know. And maybe it's small calibrations, but nonetheless, it helps you to avoid some of those pitfalls. So it's a bit of a long story. Let me try and see if I can get something shorter on the...
No, honestly, it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Okay.
Yeah. Continue.
So this is our problem on the execution side, that we have traditionally with strategy making. The other point I made is finding new stuff. Thinking differently is pretty hard as well, and that's, I think, pretty human. That's not sort of exclusive to companies. There's this term, where does it come from? Isomorphism. I think it's sociology, where it means similarity of form. We do things very similar to those around us. So, if you or I would like to lose weight, we both still pretty fit, yeah, for our age, so we don't have to. But if we want to do this, yeah, our likelihood to achieve this is a lot higher if we have friends who are into sports, into activities, rather than if we have friends who are into having long extended evening meals.
Hmm.
There's studies who looked at people who go to college, yeah, and those who have college roommates that are really good in school, their grades start to improve as well because they start to study harder.
Hmm.
Those who, I guess, like the two of us when we were young and did our internship in the United Nations, were hanging out in a flat in the lower parts of Manhattan and were
Hmm.
mainly thinking about which party to go to in the evening, grades would have not improved. Now, for us, it was just an internship, but if this is at uni, your parting skills go up,
Yeah.
less so your grades.
Yeah.
And the same we have in companies as well. Yeah, companies compare themselves with companies that are similar to themselves. They do that through benchmarking.
Hmm.
If you put yourself back 15 years ago or so into the shoes of the guys running Comcast, a company in the United States that was selling access to cable television, and you suddenly confronted with Netflix, what you do is you look at the other cable companies and see what they are doing. Now, your problem is Netflix is a lot cheaper and Netflix has no advertising. But if you look at your immediate competitors, so the other cable companies, what they are doing is in order to make up for lost revenues, they increased the monthly fees. And it's pretty high. It was, I think, $150 or so a month for subscription to cable television. And they increased the amount of advertising they show every hour in order to make up for lost revenues. That's sort of, it has a justification because others do it, and it solves your more immediate problem that you bring the return to shareholder when the next quarterly is up. But in the long run, it accelerates the problem. You're just making the problem that makes people leave in the first place even bigger.
Mm.
And without having something that stirs you away and makes you think very differently, that's pretty hard. Yeah. So that's pitfalls of this traditional strategy model. And now what open strategy does is it makes you look differently, get other people with different opinions into the discussion, and gets people, depending on how you set it up, which are closer to the front line involved as well.
So the question is like, who would that be and how do you select those people?
Wide set of options. Yeah. Basically, to do open strategies, different techniques, different instruments of how you can do this. The largest exercise I've ever come across was done by IBM quite a while back in 2007. It involved 160,000 people. Basically, everyone within IBM plus 60 partner companies in an online discussion forum for 3 days where they were talking future of IBM.
Okay.
And
Cool.
smaller ones can be super effective as well. And if I work with organizations, I'm not a tech company, I do it workshop based. We're talking 30 to 40 people maybe involved in the workshop. Part of that entire process could also be a survey where you send it out to a substantially larger group of people. But you're careful of who should be in the room then. Yeah. So you have some people from top management, you have some people from the middle management, that different bits and pieces of the organization are well represented. You need to make sure that if you have somebody from the middle management, that you get somebody who is not afraid of speaking up in a setting where you also have the senior management involved. And then, you carefully manage this process. This way you get something that works.
I just wanted to ask because I remember very early in my career, we had one of our clients was British American Tobacco. And as you can imagine, for a communications agency and with all the restrictions on tobacco, it's actually quite difficult to figure out what to do in advertising. So what they decided, they wanted to grow mainly through the introduction of new products nobody had seen before in tobacco. And what we did was innovation workshops. And that was super interesting. And one of the things that was super interesting, that was basically open up strategy. And
Very similar. Yeah. Very
we
similar.
very actively, we had two different groups. We had the more analytical group that would prefer the so-called like creative platform from which we would then innovate. That was all about analysis, looking at the consumers or looking at what is and analyzing how we can use that. And the second group, very deliberately, was figuring out who are the renegades in the company to whom we just have to throw a briefing. And then they would go and say like, oh, yeah, let's. And that was almost like 15 years ago. So it was when saving the environment became, and I remember that, I'm not saying any secrets. I mean, it's 15 years ago when saving the environment became really fancy. So we did all these like biodegradable filters, cigarettes, and all that stuff. It was really, really interesting. One
Do
big
you
part
remember
was
which of these two groups was the one that prevailed?
both. So we had
Both.
we had both groups. So we had overlaps, but both groups were important. The one group was more the down to earth, analytically very strong, being able to formulate briefing, and the second group were just like the constant renegades who would always say like, "Oh, we need to do things differently." So they were given a platform, but of course in an organized fashion, and they would probably the creative, the hotshots as we call them, the creators wouldn't probably have been able to provide the sort of guardrails that the analytical group was providing. And I find that when you talk about like we have 30, 40 people, I mean, at some point you have to choose. At some point you say, I want this person and this person and this person. And I think in one of your sentences, and I think it almost got lost, you said like, yeah, they all have to be open to new things. So how important is that having the right people in those groups and probably also briefing them in the right way?
Yeah. So post is super important. We even developed a little tool where you can self-assess whether you are open to openness. And we have found then, that there were correlations basically between having leaders of that kind, the likelihood that actually an organization successfully uses open strategy techniques. In the end, you can't force it. Yeah, if the top guys don't want it, not going to happen. So then it might be a nice little exercise, but in the long run, it's just frustrating because nothing is done with it afterwards. So yes, it's important to start with to have people who really buy into the idea in principle of doing it. And then it's really important who moderates and runs the initiative. Yeah, you need to know when you've done many workshops. Yeah, so I'm very sure it's the same thing. Yeah, if you're there in that room, you know which person you kind of need to encourage to speak a little bit more.
Yes.
Which person you maybe need to rein in a little bit because otherwise they monopolize the entire conversation. How do you then find ways to filter out the real gems in this conversation? One process that can work quite well is I often have competing groups. They develop, let's say, business model for a particular idea. They present, and then we do it Dragon Den style, yeah, where you do a short pitch, and then we have a vote. In some cases, there's even a jury, and this way we deselect the less promising ideas and get to the more promising ones, which are then in the second round developed further.
So one of the things I always do when I run innovation workshops like these, I always have a presentation. I always have people present it because without the presentation, nobody really gives their very best, I have the feeling. I mean, everybody is very happy to brainstorm, but at some point you want to get somewhere and then you want that brainstorming be also very productive. So one of the things, yes, like you said, the presentation.
And if you set it up as a competition, it's
Exactly.
even
And
more
that
so.
gives you a competition. You don't even have to set it up as a competition, I think. You just have to say like group A, group B, and group C, they will present. And it's automatically, at least in in the communication and media business, automatically becomes a competition because nobody wants to make a fool of themselves. And of course everybody wants to be better than the other group.
Yeah.
So it's the sort of automatic thing. What are the most like you've worked with many groups, what in your view are the most unexpected sources of strategic insights? I think somewhere in your book there's one great sentence: good ideas don't care about hierarchy. And I fundamentally and totally agree. I mean, this is what open strategy is all about. But I would be interested in, like, from your experience, what are the most unexpected sources of creativity, of ideation, so to speak, of strategy?
So one thing that the German consulting group always does when they run their workshops is they bring a mixture of internals and externals together. So people from other industry settings. That's a pretty good mechanism, I find, because people from a different industry often think quite differently. But if they're on their own, they lack the fine-grained understanding of a particular setting and context. Now, bringing them together, you often get this unusual way of thinking combined with what's really doable to get to some gems. I think that's one way to get into this. I have found if you probe things the right way, then you can also get good, unusual ideas. And there's one particular exercise that I like a lot. It's called a nightmare competitor exercise, where the task for different groups is come up with a competitor that does not exist. You have no restrictions in terms of, economics, funding, etc. for this competitor, but think of a company that would be a true nightmare for your own company. And that allows people, to think outside the box automatically. That tends to work really well too. Plus people love that kind of thing.
Somewhere else in the book,
You really read this stuff.
Of
I'm pleased.
course.
Thanks a lot.
Of course. And this is probably what I find the most interesting. Suppose it all runs well. You've done your workshops and management is behind it, and you're creating your minimum viable products and you're trying them out and it works. And I just have to read off the quote because I think it's so important. As a company grows and prospers, leaders shift from playing offense to defense. Once novel strategies fossilize into unthinking habits and a spirit of dissent with us. So is there a best before date for this stuff? You do it and then people have great innovations. And, I'm thinking of Apple. I really like the brand and I think they've done some groundbreaking products, the iPhone being the most pivotal one, I would say. But since then, nothing much happens. They're extremely profitable, and I get it, and they're extremely successful. But have they become a little bit like run into the motion of administrating their success rather than really hungrily looking for the next innovation?
Yeah, it's admittedly a lot harder once you've been as successful as Apple. Yeah, well, how do you come up with something as successful as the iPhone? Almost impossible. We find that a lot, of course, yeah, with companies who reach heights, then there's some substantial shifts. And it's almost surprising how long big tech has been able to stay on top through often acquisitions, yeah.
Mhm.
But even these ones, yeah, you need to get them right. It's not that easy to acquire the right company either. I struggle as well with this, yeah. I admit I can't put my finger in when is exact the right time. For large organizations, without some substantial shifts in the environment, it's extremely difficult to do something. And, these shifts can be either, well, I guess you have something at the moment, yeah, with generative AI arriving with such fanfare and hype. You had Google, another of the big tech companies, seriously rethinking the search business. But it's so difficult to do this, yeah, when you consider the vast majority of your revenues come from search and the way search is done, then to pivot towards a generative AI model will hurt. And it needed this shock from outside, I think, for Google to get serious about this. We still don't know whether they managed to do so, but at least they take it serious. Something similar in the car industry would have been the Dieselgate scandal for Volkswagen, even though it fizzled out after a while. Yeah. So I think initially then Volkswagen had this wake up call and started to sprint more in the direction of e-vehicles. But then somehow, not so profitable. Maybe the pressures reduce a little bit on making the shift so radically, and kind of was a back and forth a little bit, yeah, in the years afterwards. So they never quite managed, I think, a pivot.
One interesting case in that respect, I think, is Nokia for me as
Yeah.
well. Has something to do with Apple. Apple extremely successful in also still making a lot of profit amid all the competition they have. And some of the stuff that I used to hear, because very often when I was employed in agencies, I was employed as the guy who brings some new perspective. And then just to figure out and find out.
I'm not surprised, knowing you for a few years that you're the one who comes with the radically new idea. I'm not surprised. You're great in this stuff.
Thank you very much. The thing is, though, I just found out in almost all the environments, everybody wants to shower without getting wet.
Yeah, it's true.
So, and that's the big problem. And I think there is a lot of like Nokia must have been so happy with themselves around 2006. I always use this as an example if people are just too secure in their business. I said, imagine Nokia 2006 reminds me of the conversation we are having in this room. And then 2007, the iPhone came and Nokia was just shambles within 2 years. And then there was a press conference, I think in 2008 or 2009, and the executives of Nokia were literally crying on stage. They said that, like, quote, "We don't know what happened," unquote. And I go, "Are you serious? You don't, I mean, everybody knows what happened. Right? You were just some complacent buggers. I'm so sorry." And that's coming back to the quote from your book. Is like, company grows, everything works fine, and you do these workshops, and you're introducing something new, and you're doing a new strategy, and then there is probably a best before date for every strategy, and then you need to renew that. And that's the point where many companies, in my view, I don't have data, but it's just my observation, many companies fail. They think they have become so good by maybe opening up their strategy, by looking for new ways, and then they're administrating their success, and they're completely forgetting to do new stuff. We had the discussion, like, still in German, about our ex-chancellor, Mrs. Merkel, and how good she was in administrating what her predecessor, Schröder, had done in terms of shaking things up and doing things new. So she was administrating basically the success. And to add to I don't want to get too political, in my opinion, failed really miserably in setting up Germany for the future.
I actually interviewed Jorma Ollila. I think it was 2006. So he was the CEO of Nokia when it was still, on the up. And they had developed the technology that's necessary for a smartphone, but it didn't manage to change the business model. In their defense, it's really difficult to do this, partly because, of course, there's many, many different new stuff and things and ideas that come up. You don't know in advance which one of those is really going to work. With the benefit of hindsight, we always do, but it's a lot more difficult in advance. Even if you do, it's tricky. We had this early on, with the, I guess, cable television versus Netflix example that I gave. Even if you know it, it's really hard at the same time to satisfy shareholders at one point in time, but make changes that are important in the long run. It's your analogy about you want to shower without getting wet. It's just tricky. And I think open strategy helps to some extent, because you can build up some pressure, the right type of pressure internally to get things moving into a new space.
What I would think then is the company's responsibility, and then also leadership's responsibility, is setting up a process so that this is not a one-off thing that you're doing, but then you're constantly checking yourself. You're constantly opening up your strategy. And I like the idea of getting people from the outside, because that's the point. I think you mentioned the cable TV example, is people tend to look at their direct competitors, so that they tend to look at the share of market, but not the share of mind, or the share of purse, or the share of moment, for example. So Coca-Cola's competitors are other fizzy drinks, but it's also like, if you think about the youth, it's also like, do I spend my money on a Coca-Cola, or do I spend my money on a chewing gum, or do I spend my money on extra Wi-Fi, on extra data, or do I spend my money on the online game, on the extra bits I can get out of the online game? So, and thinking in that way, I think, is super important. So if you bring in, like, if open strategy means to bring in people from the outside, I think that's a very, very smart way to really make sure you're not like, I don't know the English saying,
Placement?
to cook in your own broth, right?
Right. Yeah.
You're always like in your own kind of bubble, and you're not getting into a blue ocean if you're only fishing in the red ocean, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's absolutely. Yeah.
What is,
Um,
sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, that element of open strategy is also the one that probably got more attention. Whereas, having worked with quite a lot of organizations, I tend to see the execution side as the even bigger problem. That, to get things done and get people excited about it and to move along, it's really tricky. And, naturally, the larger the organization, the more difficult it tends to be. A positive example of a company that did this really well by opening up was Barclays retail business in the United Kingdom in 2012. And I bring this example because it fits with this change of the landscape. Now, it was starting to become clear that banking is going to change. Yeah, it's going to be more mobile, it's going to be more online. And that's sort of, fair enough. Yeah. But how do you get a 325-year-old organization with 30,000 people working there to make the necessary changes, considering the first thing that somebody working in a bank branch will think of when they hear digitalization, they'll think, what about my job?
Mhm.
They're
Mhm.
worried about this mainly. So how do we get them to change? And they did this online forum for 3 days where people could start about the implications of these things, found ways to break it down so it becomes an enabler for them, but didn't threaten their job. Yeah? And the bank did extremely well in making the switch. They introduced a mobile app not long after this initiative that is today one of the most successful fintech products of the company. That self-help groups, the digital eagles that were starting being organized by some of the more digitally literate people, those who were better with online stuff, to help those who were not so much into this, and make these changes, So they brought people on board rather than bring a topic on their plate where they're just afraid.
I think this is a great example for process and how much process is needed and how much thinking needs to go into the process. Not only how you prepare the actual disruption, so to speak, using that buzzword, breaking things up and creating new things, but also like what comes after it and how do you get this big company of how many people, 160,000 people,
Yeah.
how do you get them all on board? I think that's really a really great example. Any other, like maybe not so big company, a smaller company? Any other favorite like real world example where open strategy really works very well?
Sure. I mean, it works typically in settings well when there's something going on that changes quite a bit and you're wondering about what to do. I've worked with a company in Cyprus recently that's in the shipping business.
Hmm.
They man ships essentially, and they have also a service arm where they're trying to, make their offers attractive for a wider market, not their own. And you've ran one of those nightmare competitor exercises where they were able to really get outside the organization first to think about unusual situations. And once the entire exercise was done, we were done coming back. Okay, is there ways for us to translate this into offerings for our organization? In other words, sort of steal the idea that we created ourselves here. It's early days to say whether this will work, but they were pretty unusual and cool ideas, and nonetheless a true logic of how this can actually be done by the organization. That's a relatively small organization that has done that.
And how would you say is coming back a little to the original question? How did specifically open strategy and the open strategy kind of mindset and process help them to do it in a different way that they probably couldn't have done if they had done it the old closed door way?
Yeah, one of the issues you have in small companies often is that it's very owner centered, or maybe one or two top managers, and everyone else is so busy in the operational day-to-day business that they don't even have the mind space. Now, a setup like this enables those people who actually, know how things have to be done the best, because they constantly work with customers, to now have the freedom to think a little bit more widely and to translate this into businesses. But by being involved, they will also afterwards know, what do I need to do to make this happen, rather than getting an idea from the boss where they're trying to wonder, how should we possibly ever kind of make this happen here? And that's really cool to see, how people get excited about this and can make this connection to the jobs that they have to do.
Different bit of a different topic. AI. I have to ask you because everybody's speaking about AI. I love,
We
honestly,
can't do podcasts without AI. Yeah, it's impossible.
I mean, I love the tools. I'm using them myself. What's AI's role in that strategy world that
Yeah.
you're in?
So, the way I framed open strategy is pretty much you get unusual voices into the strategy process.
Hmm.
And one of those unusual voices can be AI. You can use an LLM to come up with something that maybe you don't think about. You can use it simply to disrupt you as well. I've done this experiment for a year with Gieswein. They are a Austrian company that produces sneakers out of wool, 80 million revenue companies, good mid-sized organization. And for a year, I regularly joined them armed with ChatGPT. During the board meeting, I would kind of come up and I have 5 pages for them to read on something they were in the midst of discussing.
Mm-hmm.
What that did is made them stop and think. The two people who ran the organizations, they're brothers. They know each other their whole life, so they can almost complete their sentences and know how the respective other is thinking. The input from ChatGPT was different, unusual. It was not always useful, but it made them stop in the track. And this way it can be a nice additional fresh voice in the process. That's I think the best way how I would use AI as a player that is new and in the spirit of open strategy.
I think yes. I would agree. Whenever I use AI in strategy work, is for two. It's to do the pedestrian work. So to do
Sure.
analysis, looking for data. I mean, basically, it's instead of me crawling the internet for 2 days, AI can deliver most of it in a great summary within seconds almost, or maximum a minute, which is a huge. It's easing the pedestrian work. And then the second one is, and there it comes to how like smart you are in terms of prompting it or training it, is be a source of inspiration. It's like, oh, I haven't thought about this way. That's interesting. Or, oh, wow, okay. But then it doesn't do the strategy work for you. So at least not now. Maybe in 5 to 10 years, we would be there. But now it's already a lot, but it's nothing more than an inspiration. I would like to do a small lightning round, really, like very quick. I've got 4 questions. One strategy buzzword you would like to eliminate forever.
5 forces.
I'm sorry, what?
5 forces.
5 forces, okay. Most overrated leadership habit.
Charisma.
Company doing open strategy right, quietly.
DMC.
And then the final one is, what will open strategy 2.0 look like?
It will insert AI.
Christian, thank you very much for this interview.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.